Tonight we will vote on a conservative budget that balances within about 5 years and saves the country from trillions of dollars of new debt. This budget that will be presented as an alternative also allows us to repeal Obamacare at the same time. We've taken the identical language from the underlying budget, put it into the replacement budget, but we've done something different. Instead of allowing spending to continue to grow unabated, instead of allowing spending to grow at such a rate that we will add $9.7 trillion to the debt, we do something novel, something that I consider to be the conservative vision for our country. We actually freeze spending. We just say no more spending. Interestingly, the budget will balance. The country's budget would actually balance, and we wouldn't add $9.7 trillion if we simply freeze spending. Now, I think there's something in my version of a budget for both Republicans and Democrats, because mine calls for a freeze in spending, but would allow the different appropriation committees to decide where the spending would be cut. So, for example, if you decided that we needed more military spending, but you thought maybe we could spend less on corporate welfare, you might cut out the Department of Commerce. You might not know it once we did it. You might not know that the Department of Commerce really could be eliminated, and you really wouldn't notice that it was gone. We look at the budget and we look at the spending every year, and we recount all of these terrible, wasteful episodes of spending, and yet they never get fixed. Why? Because we continue to give government more money. The current budget that we will vote on will increase spending at about 5% a year. And you will hear from people this Washingtonese, this language that says, well, we're just holding to the baseline. All this is the baseline, son. Just vote for the baseline. Jump on the team and vote for the baseline. The problem is that the baseline's not flat. The baseline is inclined, and that increase in spending every year is what's bankrupting the country. Spending is going up at about 5% a year. That's what the baseline is. And so when people say, oh, we're going to cut trillions of dollars, this is a frugal budget, they're talking about cutting spending from the proposed increases in spending. To illustrate that, the budget that I'm offering isn't even a cut of any kind. It's a freeze. Anybody in America ever had their income frozen? Anybody in America ever had to take a cut? Why shouldn't government? Why shouldn't we force government to look at their finances and say, you know what, this spending is good and this is not so good? I'll give you an example. We spent $700,000 last year studying Neil Armstrong's statement on the moon. Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and said, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And your government, in its infinite wisdom, spent $700,000 to study that, to determine whether Neil Armstrong said, one small step for a man or one small step for man. And after spending $700,000, your government concluded that they still don't know. They spent $500,000 studying selfies. If you take a selfie of yourself and you smile, will you feel better later? They spent $2 million studying whether or not, if you're standing in food line at a buffet and the guy in front of you sneezes on the food, are you more or less likely to want to eat the food? You can't make this stuff up. And yet, the budget that we're being offered does nothing to fix any of that. It just puts a stamp down and says, we're going to keep doing things the same way we have always done them. Well, my friends, I think we should do things differently. I think a $20 trillion debt is alarming. I think it's the number one problem we face as a country, and someone ought to do something about it. So I didn't have much luck saying, you know what, guys, we should produce a balanced budget. And so what we got is $9.7 trillion, and I just can't support that. So I've offered an alternative. For people who believe that debt is a problem, they can vote for my alternative, and it still maintains the exact same language that the underlying budget has for repealing Obamacare. You can do both. Why should it be an either or? Why should it be, well, we have to vote for a crummy budget, but that's the only way we can get to Obamacare? Well, why don't we vote for a budget that balances? I thought that's what we were for. You see, I remember a time when Republicans talked not even just about freezing spending. Some of them actually said we should reduce the size and scope of government. That's what Ronald Reagan said. And yet government grows inexorably. over and over again, year after year, government grows. We had Republicans in charge about 10 years ago, remember? George W. Bush was president. We controlled, I think, both branches for at least one period of time. And yet the debt doubled under George W. Bush's administration from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. Under President Obama, it's gone from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. And now you have Republicans say, just put us in charge. Put us in charge of the House. You did, 2010. Put us in charge of the Senate. You did in 2014. Put us in charge of all three branches, and we will make conservative vision for the country. We will balance budgets. We will reduce spending. And yet, this is an all-Republican Congress where only Republicans will vote on the budget today. And yet, we're going to be voting on a budget that will add $9.7 trillion. Now, I'm told by some, well, you know what? This really isn't a budget. We're going to call it the vehicle to repeal Obamacare. Well, that's not what it's called. It's sitting right here. It's called the concurrent resolution on the budget for 2017 because, whoops, we didn't get to it last year, but we're getting to it this year. So this is a budget. It does have numbers in it. And I think the numbers in the budget are of significance. I think when we look at the numbers, we should make them mean something. But people say to me, they say, well, the numbers don't mean anything. Just vote for it so we can repeal Obamacare. We got to repeal Obamacare. So just vote for the numbers, no matter what they are. And I guess my response is, if the numbers don't mean anything, why don't we put good numbers in there? If the budget is inconsequential and means absolutely nothing, only Republicans are going to vote for it. Why don't we put numbers in there that lead to balance? Because then we could go home to the people who voted for us and said they wanted us to balance the budget and said they wanted us to restrain spending, and we could say we did what you told us to do. Instead, I got to go home and tell people that the Republicans introduced a budget that'll add $9.7 trillion. Now, I am told, oh, we're going to do a better job. In about 3 or 4 months from now, we'll do it again. But I tell you what I fear is in 3 or 4 months, when they come back to do this again, they'll say, well, you already voted for it once. Why not vote for it again? It's the same thing you voted for last time. It's just the baseline. Well, the baseline's not flat. The baseline's increasing at 5% a year, and that's a problem. We have to look at spending across the board. All of the spending has to be looked at. The great thing about what I've offered as an alternative is, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, it doesn't define exactly where you have to have the cuts come from. It says what the overall number would be, and actually we're not talking about cuts, we're talking about freezing spending. But what you could do to get to a freeze is, you could cut or eliminate some parts of government, like maybe the $700,000 we spent studying Neil Armstrong's statement could be eliminated completely. Maybe the $30 billion that we spend on corporate welfare in the Department of Commerce, maybe that could be eliminated and not one poor person would go hungry, and maybe a couple of rich CEOs would fly in their own jet instead of a taxpayer jet when they're flying around the world. You could eliminate things like the Department of Commerce, and you could keep spending for other items. If you think the military is bloated, you could actually cut money in the military and spend it on other items of budget. The bottom line is, if you vote for this amendment, you will be voting for fiscal conservatism that says enough's enough. We have a $20 trillion debt. We're borrowing $1 million a minute, and enough's enough. So if you are a fiscal conservative, if you're worried about the debt of the country, I hope you will support my amendment, which replaces the underlying budget with a federal, on-budget spending freeze and actually leads the budget to balance in the near future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
It's my understanding that there's 2 minutes equally divided now between the proposer and the opposition.
Senator from Wyoming. Who yields time?
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I propose that the Senate vote for this budget because it leads to balance, it's fiscally conservative, it allows the Senate and Congress to decide where money will be spent and where it won't, will eliminate waste, and above all, will get us on the right track towards eliminating or at least staying the expansion of a $20 trillion debt. I think this is the biggest problem we face as a country. As much as I think Obamacare is a mistake, just ignoring the debt to get to Obamacare is also a mistake. And so I would ask the Senate for those who are or claim to be fiscally conservative, that you will consider voting for a budget that actually balances and continues to have the language underlying in it that would allow us to also repeal Obamacare.